Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to AER Live, a series of online interactive workshops from Applied Ecology Resources. I am Dr. Ollie Watts from the Royal Society for Protection of the Birds, or RSPB, and I'm delighted you've all joined today for a very special workshop on nature-based solutions, which, as you will all know, is getting a lot of headlines, and rightly so, right at the moment. But first, just a couple of other things to point you towards. The first one is that this month's AER Spotlight is on the BES Scottish Policy Group's document, Guide to COP26. This guide is a brilliant introduction to this year's United Nations Climate Change Conference of the Parties, or COP26, which of course starts actually right at the end of this month, properly on the 1st of November in Glasgow, in Scotland. The Spotlight provides a comprehensive summary of international climate legislation and some of the key issues that are on this year's agenda. And you can discover why COP26 is so significant, if you haven't copped that already, and how climate science particularly interacts with international policy at these events. So that's a really interesting one. The full guide will soon be available on the AER's platform. In the meantime, you can visit a website to find out more, and that's simply BritishEcologicalSociety.org/policy/COP26 to find out more. Then there's the latest issue of our open access journal, Ecological Solutions and Evidence. That's now online. Here you can discover a diverse range of article types and topics, from ecological research and practice, including our editor's choice article, which highlights how the guidance of supporting ecological mitigation practice for housing developments is often out of date or based on incomplete evidence. So a great example of how the research itself can become the evidence base to support policymakers and government agencies taking action to make improvements to current practices that directly affect nature and biodiversity. You can find out more articles like this in our latest collection at another website coming up, Ecological Solutions and Evidence, all one word, that is .org. Right, back to today. This AER Live workshop is based around the British Ecological Society's landmark report, Nature-Based Solutions for Climate Change in the UK, which was published early in the summer. The aim of this report is to provide decision makers with a comprehensive evidence base supporting and informing the opportunities and the correct application of nature-based solutions to tackle climate change. Nature-based solutions have gained much attention recently, particularly in the run-up to the climate COP in Glasgow. For climate change, they're an essential part of our actions, both for reducing greenhouse gas emissions to meet mitigation targets, and for adapting our lives to the ongoing impacts and trajectory of climate change. But what are NbS? Simply and essentially, NbS are actions that benefit both people and nature. So NbS projects such as emissions reduction, flood management, or urban infrastructure, they should all have objectives both for people and for nature, and both of those should be monitored. Despite their wide-reaching benefits, we are not using nature-based solutions as the go-to approach wherever they do offer a greener, more multifunctional approach to emissions reduction, land management, and infrastructure development. And this was a key motivation in developing the report to get much more traction and buy-in and use. The report itself, over 150 individuals contributed to the report in some capacity, primarily from across academia, but also from statutory agencies, environmental NGOs like the RSPB, and ecological practitioners. So a very wide base of people contributed to this. And today we will be hearing from some of those contributors. We're joined today by Dr. Mike Moorcroft and Dr. Isabella Alonso, both from Natural England, the government agency that advises on England's natural environment. Unfortunately, we were hoping to have Professor Chris Collins from the University of Reading with us. Unfortunately, he's now unable to join, but we will be giving his presentation. And before I hand over to our first speaker, just a couple of housekeeping things. First of all, the workshop will be recorded and posted online, so please keep your camera and audio off at all times. And then we have a question and answer session after the presentation. So please send any questions or comments during the workshop. You can either scan the QR code on the screen, or you can visit slido.com with the code 737960. And we'll be sharing these Q&A towards the end. Right, let's get on with things. Without waiting any longer, please can I hand over to Dr. Mike Moorcroft, our first speaker for today's workshop, who is talking about implementing nature-based solutions in practice. Over to you, Mike.
Great. Well, thanks, Ollie. Yeah, it's good to be here and to talk about this this really important topic that is very much of the moment. Excellent. Right. Okay. So I'm going to give an overview of nature-based solutions for climate change, and drawing on this very good report. I am biased because I was on the steering group for it and contributed to the editing and writing of it. But the power of the report really is that it's the work of such a large group of people from the BES community. But there were 5 themes that we pulled out there. The nature-based solutions deliver for climate and nature. They also deliver for health and prosperity. But the right frameworks and policies to deliver NbS at scale still need to be developed. But there's a window of opportunity to do this. To do that, though, it's really important to do the right thing in the right place. And we also need the right evidence in place to guide those decisions. So my presentation this afternoon is going to look at those different elements, those 5 key themes in more detail. So first of all, our first key finding was that nature-based solutions can make an important contribution to net zero, biodiversity, and climate change adaptation targets. So long as, and it's an important caveat, this one, so long as they're not treated as a substitute for widespread emission reductions or wider nature conservation action. So particularly, I think at the moment, there is a bit of a tendency, in some quarters anyway, to look to things that we can do, like tree planting, as ways of offsetting the carbon emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions that we are producing as a society. And we have to be realistic. It can do it, but the scope for it is relatively limited, and it's no substitute for reducing emissions from other sectors. It's something we have to do as well as. And this is the UK greenhouse gas emission inventory by sector. And if you look, the biggest emissions on the left-hand side of this figure here are from transport and energy supply, going through business, residential, and so on. But you'll see there's 2 blue arrows. One's agriculture, and one's on the far right, the mysterious LULUCF, which stands for land use change, and forestry. And a lot of the natural environment management options for the land are under that bracket. But if you look at them, there's 2 things to say. First of all, at the moment, the way we use land is a net contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. It's not a net sequestration. So first of all, we've got to stop the emissions from those sources. But then if you look at the scale of them, it isn't credible to think that we could turn them around to such an extent that they drop below the line by enough to offset present emissions from energy and transport. We just need to be realistic. Nature-based solutions are part of the solution, part of the overall solution, but they're not the whole of it. It's a slightly different picture in different countries, and globally there is good potential, but we need to keep it in perspective. And I just want to explore a little bit more about the benefits and the actions that nature-based solutions can deliver on climate change specifically. We'll come on to some wider things in a moment. But in terms of climate change mitigation, so this is, when we talk about mitigation in the context of climate change, it means reducing emissions, or reducing net emissions anyway, reducing the forcing, the radiative forcing, reducing the heating of the earth. And so the key things here, the biggest opportunities in the UK anyway, are for woodland creation, growing trees take up carbon. But also we need to restore our peatlands. They're one of the largest sources of emissions, or the largest source of emissions to the atmosphere from our land surface. So actually stopping our degraded peatlands, like this one on the top left at Bolton Fell Moss, an extracted site that was used for horticultural peat, stopping the emissions from sites like that and those which have been drained to try and improve agriculture or for growing crops on, both in the uplands and the lowlands. Trying to stop that is a key element here. But there's also good potential from some other habitats, and particularly the coastal ones. So salt marsh restoration and seagrass on the coast get a lot of attention. One thing just to bear in mind is that those aren't represented in national emissions statistics at the moment. Not a reason not to do it as a good thing in its own right, but it is a barrier to including in greenhouse gas emission targets internationally, and that simply reflects the fact that we don't have the sort of evidence base for them that we do have for woodlands, for example. I'll come back to that point later. But anyway, some good opportunities there. And Isabella and Ollie, on behalf of Chris, will be talking about some others. But it's not just about emissions. We also have to adapt to climate change. Adapting to climate change means minimizing risks, and in a few cases, taking advantage of some opportunities. But really, it's about reducing risk. Climate change is here and now. We already have about a degree of warming in the UK. We already see an enhanced risk of flooding and drought and wildfire and so on. So we need to adapt, but there's no getting away from that. And even if we could turn off all the emission sources tomorrow, we would still have locked in climate change for the next couple of decades. The temperature would go on rising. So we have to cope with that change. And there's a challenge there for those of us who work in conservation. It's a threat to our conservation in its own right. But there's also things we can do to reduce the risks to people from things like flooding and drought. And nature can help us with that. So we've got some examples here. Renaturalizing watercourses of rivers, that reduces the flood risk. It slows the flow, stores water. We can realign the coast so that we create semi-natural habitats to provide a buffer against rising sea levels. We can also help to prevent flooding in urban areas by creating wetlands, like this site here near the Olympic Park, the Queen Elizabeth Country Park in London, or provide shading from trees. So there's opportunities here for a win-win for nature at the same time as protecting people. So one of our subsidiary themes, I suppose, to that overarching one about the opportunities that are there, is that NbS offers a lot of, or when done well, offers a lot of other opportunities on top of the headline climate change ones. Good for health and prosperity. But routes for private investment alongside public finance are emerging, but need further development. So it's good for us in its own right to have good natural places to enjoy. But in terms of the investment side of things, to actually get investment flows in, there are some examples like the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Code, but they're not there yet. There's more work to be done. And also work on the governance and regulation of those to make sure they really do deliver for people and nature. We also got to have the right frameworks and policies in place to deliver nature-based solutions at scale. They're evolving, but the governance and evaluation needs to improve. So one of the approaches to that, which I'm involved with, is a new pilot program to try out nature-based solutions at the landscape scale. So we can develop the evidence based on the science, but also look at what works in terms of incentive and regulation and some of the socio-economic impacts. So pilot studies are a good way forward to seize that window of opportunity. And another key theme, which is linked to that, is that we actually need to do the right thing in the right place. To get the multiple benefits of nature-based solutions requires careful spatial planning And we've seen examples in the UK of both good and bad examples of the relationship between trees and peat, both key nature-based solutions for climate change. On the right-hand side here is a good example where at Rowdsey Moss in Cumbria, where trees have been removed to restore a healthy bog. Bogs don't usually support trees in the UK, with the exception of some valley bogs in the lowlands, but a raised bog or an upland blanket bog rarely has trees. And yet what do we do sometimes? We go and plough our peatlands to plant trees. And there's a bad example of that also from Cumbria. That's what you're looking at there on the left-hand side is a net source of greenhouse gas emissions. So doing the right thing in the right place, planting trees in the right place really matters. And actually globally, it's the same situation. And particularly with the tree planting agenda, there are some bad examples, for example, in the savannas of planting trees when it should be a more sparsely wooded system. And the final key thread that we pulled out was around getting the right evidence. And there are knowledge gaps and uncertainties which currently do hamper a more widespread use. And just to give you a quick example of that, in Natural England, we recently reviewed carbon storage and sequestration by different habitats. And we found good evidence on some habitats, but also some big gaps. I've alluded to those earlier on some of the coastal habitats, for example. But even some different things, some different types of habitat, for example, some types of woodland are poorly known. So we've got to fill some of those evidence gaps. For those in the research community, there's an opportunity there. My time is up, but I've only just been able to touch on a small part of the report, the headline messages, but you can see this is the contents, and we're just going to get a taster on firstly heathlands and secondly on arable systems. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Isabella.
My name is Isabella Alonso. I work like Mike for Natural England. I've been with the organization for nearly 23 years now, and 22 of those was working on heathlands. So yeah, a couple of things I did just before leaving that job was to contribute to both reports that Mike mentioned before, the Nature-Based Solutions report published by the NbS and the Natural England carbon impact of management. So I will be referring to both of those today. Again, some of my introduction, Mike already mentioned, so we've got more and more evidence that it's better to try to deliver and address climate change and the climate change and the biodiversity crisis in parallel, and not put them in different boxes and solve one before the other, because it's more efficient to try and address both of them. But again, as Mike said, people, because the nature-based solutions are attractive propositions and they are out there now in people's mind, some of them launch into delivery with considering all aspects. And I had a couple of slides here. The first one is again similar to what Mike mentioned. Planting trees on peat soil is not a good idea. It will release more carbon than probably sequester on the cycle of the plantation. So I won't talk about that much. The second one is it was planting trees on a species-rich calcareous grassland. And again, if we are trying to address climate change and biodiversity, and we are damaging the biodiversity value of a site, maybe it's not a good idea. So again, as Mike said, the right trees and the right solutions in the right places. And this is especially a risk for open habitats in many parts of the world. So I will talk in particular about one of them, about heathlands. I understand that we may have an international audience today, so I'm not quite sure where you are. If you are in the UK or in Western Europe, you probably are familiar with heathlands. But for others, maybe from other parts of the world, I will mention now what we call heathlands. These are a few pictures of how they look like. And what they are a mosaic of wet, humid, and dry habitats in mainly acidic soils and nutrient-poor soils. They are characterized by species of the family Ericaceae, what we call heathers. This is in Western Europe. In other parts of the world, there are similar habitats, but they will be characterized by other families. They can be natural in exposed conditions, like high in the mountains or in coastal areas. But in most cases, again, in Western Europe, they are the result of people management. They were created and maintained by people felling trees, cutting vegetation, burning and grazing over millennia, really. And we say that to be in good condition, they have to have not only heathers, but also other features like trees, bare ground, grassland, and wetland that will increase their biodiversity value. Why we think they are important? Because we've got very little left. We have lost in the UK about 80% of what we had in the 19th century. And the figures are even worse in other countries in Europe, in Denmark, in Germany and other countries. At the same time as the extent has shrunk, of course, we have the abundance of the species has decreased. And some species which some people may consider quite common, like Calluna vulgaris, common heather, or other types of heather, or in wetter areas, cotton grass, they are now considered near threatened or vulnerable because this range shrinking. But even with that, we've got these habitats are still very important for biodiversity. In the lowlands in England, we've got about 133 species which are associated with them. In the uplands, 35 priority species. And again, I must say that in most countries in Europe, people talk about just heathlands, but in the UK, we separate uplands and lowlands. And it's not really an ecological separation. It's more due to management and the different problems and the way we have managed them in the past and today. This is just very quickly a summary of the ecosystem services, so the benefits for people that these habitats can provide. This is from the UK National Ecosystem Assessment. And you can see that they can provide food, wild food, fresh water, in terms of cultural services or benefits, field sports, biodiversity, the cultural associations, they are very important for archaeology. And in terms of regulating services, water regulation, erosion prevention, and many others. So they are important habitats, not only for biodiversity, but for people as well. Mike also mentioned that some of the solutions that have been proposed, and the main one being restoring peatlands. And I've got in this drawing, this picture, the amount of carbon in peat is very important. So we found that we're about 1,000 to 2,000 tons of CO2 per hectare in peat soils. But heathlands, these open habitats, are also have a significant amount. So heathland soil contain between 300 to almost 400 tons of CO2 per hectare, which compares quite favorably when you compare it with woodland soils. Of course, the woodlands have more carbon in the biomass in the wood, but the heathland vegetation is lower. But we have to consider the whole system, and heathlands have 94 to 99% of the carbon stock is in the soil. So we need to look not only above ground but also below ground. As I said, the heathlands were originated with people managing them, cutting trees, burning, cutting the vegetation, and grazing. And these are things that we still do nowadays in many cases for conservation, but they all have implications for the carbon that's stored in the systems. So looking at what are the main impacts, if we think about maintenance, just maintaining the heathlands which need management, it could be a carbon positive management. When we talk about light grazing and no burning, heathlands could sequester carbon. On the other hand, if we look at the worst we can do is probably drain them. that will release a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. Some people are thinking maybe adding some trees to heathlands, and the current evidence shows that it could result in carbon emissions, at least in the short term. So we have to consider the impact of these different types of management on the habitat. This is just an example. The pictures have two different sites, but just to show the point, the one on the left would be a degraded upland heathland covered on with grass. If we restore that degraded heath, you can, well, the degraded heath will have 52, the figures in green are the vegetation, 52 tons of CO2 per hectare, the soil over 300 tons of CO2 per hectare. If we restore it, the amount of carbon in the vegetation decreases a bit, but the amount in the soil increases more. So we gain by restoring the habitat to good condition. We manage to sequester carbon in the soil. If we compare that with a target upland heathland, the capacity of the soil to continue storing carbon is still even greater. So yeah, we are aiming for conserving biodiversity and dealing with climate change and carbon sequestration in this case, but sometimes we need to think about the trade-offs. So letting heathlands, open habitats scrub up or planting them may release more carbon from the soil than the trees and the shrubs we sequester, even if we consider decades. Removing plantations to improve the condition of the open habitat may result in carbon emissions in the short term, but will benefit the carbon stores in the soils, which are the big stores. Grazing, we didn't look at grazing in a lot of detail, and we say that grazing is necessary to maintain the condition of many heathland sites, but could increase the emission of greenhouse gases. So maybe cutting and mowing could be an option with fewer trade-offs for both carbon and also for costs. So when thinking about nature-based solutions for heathlands, and considering that management is necessary, if we don't manage the heathlands, they will become something else. The management can result in some emissions, but also sequestration of carbon. But the important thing is to avoid or reduce the amount of soil disturbance and restore the hydrology. Whenever we can, restore the hydrology to allow this system to sequester more carbon. And of course, if we can create more habitat from other land uses like arable land, we will increase further the amount of carbon in soils and vegetation. So just to finish, nature-based solution in heathlands in particular is a very new field, and it requires further research. When we were doing this work, we found that most of the research has been done in the uplands and in wet heathlands. So looking at other types of soils and other vegetation is important and will give us more information to look at these trade-offs. And yeah, we need to know that we need to consider the whole system, and there will be sometimes some trade-offs between the measures to enhance biodiversity and those to increase carbon sequestration. And we need to consider short versus long-term goals. So that's me. And now I will hand over to Ollie Watts for the next section.
Thank you very much, Isabel. And before we do start the next session, just another plea, please, for questions on Slido. Slido.com, the code is 737960, and there are joining details in the chat as well, so please do put your questions there. Well, as I said earlier, Professor Chris Collins is unfortunately no longer able to join us today, so I'm going to present his overview of nature-based solutions in arable systems, and I'd like to thank Chris for providing the slides and the talk for me to be able to do that, because I don't actually know very much about this myself. So I'm not the first to say this, but right now, there's a unique opportunity to improve our natural environment. There's huge traction, there's huge appetite to apply nature-based solutions, and there's a whole new policy area emerging. So it really is, the time really is ripe for this, for nature-based solutions, develop them, and how they can contribute to reaching our biodiversity goals and our net zero targets. So we're at a pivotal moment in the future design of our agricultural systems. As we've left the EU, we've left the Common Agricultural Policy behind us. We'll come on to that a little bit later. Arable farming accounts for 26% of the 19 million hectares of agricultural land in the UK, so that's just over a quarter. 17% of that is cereals, other arable is 8%, and horticulture is 1%. That's of the total agricultural land. Arable land is arable land is under the most active management of all of our agricultural systems, and so because of that offers the opportunity to introduce solutions to improve wider ecosystem service provision, being mindful, of course, of the need to maintain food production. So we need to consider exactly where we implement NbS in arable systems, largely avoiding the highest productivity land, and we don't want to take that out of production. And instead we look to make these arable environments in those areas less hostile to nature, for example, through introducing hedgerows. And we must also note that changing diets as a consequence of increased environmental and animal welfare awareness and concerns means that we actually may have to expand our cropland if we're to avoid offshoring more production and potentially causing harm in other areas of the world, which again clearly isn't the win-win we're after. So it's clear that arable agriculture is responsible for significant greenhouse gas emissions, both on and off the farm, particularly in arable agriculture. For example, there are a lot of associated greenhouse gases in the production of fertilizer, which is incredibly energy intensive. There are also specific issues around associated activities, soil nitrous oxide release as a consequence of fertilizer use, and methane release from waterlogged soils. And as we well know, peatland degradation is a huge concern, particularly in the lowland fen areas that are used for intensive agriculture. Many studies show that biodiversity is profoundly impacted by arable farming, with significant reductions in farmland birds and insects. For example, there has been a 48% decline in the UK farm bird indicator since 1970, and large declines in insects have also been reported, with specific intensive agricultural practices being put at the cause of those. However, some studies do indicate more variability than a steady decline in biomass. So we need to look at that a little bit further and understand more. In the BES's Nature-Based Solutions report, we've looked at a number of different ways in which NbS can be practically applied by farmers and landowners on the ground in arable landscapes. And we've evaluated the evidence for these for both carbon and biodiversity benefits. And here I'm going to highlight three for which we have high confidence that they can deliver multiple benefits. Let's start with hedgerows. They're important as linear features and they enable connectivity, which was emphasised as being important in John Lawton's report, Making Space for Nature, calling that's nearly 11 or 12 years old now. A study by Walton in 2015 recorded that there are over 2,070 species of animals, plants and fungi in a single hedgerow in Devon. That was over a 2-year period. So that shows there can be huge reservoirs for biodiversity. And we also know that butterflies and bees use hedgerows for navigation. And so again, it's really important to include hedgerows within the landscape. In terms of carbon storage and greenhouse gas mitigation, we know that above ground, uncut shrubby hedges may accumulate around 1.8 tonnes of carbon dioxide per hectare per year. Tree lines may accumulate roughly 10 times that, around 11 tonnes of carbon dioxide per hectare per year. And the soils under hedgerows are also very high in carbon compared to the neighbouring neighbouring arable land. Hedgerows also enhance water storage and help bind soil to reduce erosion across the field, so benefits for farming as well. Our second nature-based solution we want to discuss this afternoon is the inclusion of buffer strips and field margins. So grassy margins hold more species and higher numbers of insects than other biota compared to field edges. We know they also offer pollination services as they're refugia for those very important insects required for the pollination of crops. They can also enhance pest regulation. So again, important for biodiversity and also contributing to farming. From the greenhouse gas perspective, the grassy field margins alongside annual crops have up to 37% higher soil carbon in the upper 30 centimetre soil layer compared to arable fields without a grass margin. And this is partly due to increased plant cover and diversity. They also have secondary benefits. Grassy margins reduce both surface and subsurface flows of nutrients, and they slow and can even halt sediment entering water courses, where it can harm wildlife or make the purification of water more difficult and more expensive for water companies. Our third NbS example is agroforestry, integrating trees and shrubs into agricultural systems. It's actually not very widely practiced in the UK yet, although there are some pioneering examples, such as Whitehall Farm in Cambridgeshire and Parkhill Farm in Fife. And yet it's been more recently actively researched in France and is practiced in some other European countries like Spain. It's primarily a huge benefit for greenhouse gas mitigation. The average carbon storage by agroforestry systems has been estimated up to 63 tonnes of carbon per hectare in temperate regions. Soil carbon in arable land has been shown to increase with the presence of rows of trees, likely due to the input of tree litter. Trees and shrubs also provide habitat, similar to well-managed hedgerows, and can increase the presence of agronomically beneficial species, such as spiders and beetles. Again, they can enhance soil protection by reducing soil erosion and improving the utilisation of nutrients, because they have a different root morphology. And they can also provide shade to animals and indeed potentially to crops underneath them as well in hotter summers. Another important aspect of agroforestry is that it allows farmers to diversify, potentially giving them a more stable and sustainable income by diversifying their income stream, as trees can be selected for their economic value, particularly fruits and timber. Slight warning, this economic value does need to be balanced against the increased complexity of farming operations, so that needs careful consideration in terms of how it's actually done. Turning to policy, the 25-year Environment Plan for England was launched in 2018, and since then the ongoing development of the Environment Bill, the Agriculture Bill, has combined to give us a pivotal moment in the environmental management of our landscapes. Specifically with regards to agriculture, there has been the development of schemes like the Environmental Land Management Scheme, ELMS in England, Glasteer in Wales, the Agricultural Transformation Programme in Scotland, and Northern Ireland's environmental farming schemes. These schemes have the focus of giving public money for public good on the whole. An important step forward from the EU's Common Agricultural Policy and its basic payment scheme, which paid farmers based on the area of land that they owned. Now, whilst that could be supplemented with schemes like countryside stewardship, the majority of money was purely land area based. Now, the new financial arrangements in the Agriculture Bill of public payments for public goods will be able to pay farmers for maintaining soil health, for improving water quality, for carbon storage, and for other nature-based solutions. In England, the national pilot of ELMS is expected in late 2021 with the full rollout in 2024. So it'll be really interesting to monitor and see how this develops in the coming months. Finally, and again in England, the Environment Bill is largely focused around targets, with DEFRA spending a lot of time to devise what those targets can be and what they can actually put their money behind. These include enhancing biodiversity, which is clearly fundamental to the expansion in the application of nature-based solutions. And additionally, on an international level, at the CBD COP15 high-level segment discussions this week, there was a huge emphasis given by many different countries to the potential of NbS as a way to tackle the twin crises of biodiversity loss and climate change. So very much a developing set of policies coming through from individual countries across the UK and indeed at the global scale through the CBD. One final point to mention before finishing is the importance of tackling climate and biodiversity challenges together, and I'm pleased this has already been mentioned. Some of you may be familiar with the report from the Climate Change Committee on our land use policies and how to achieve net zero. One key finding of that report is the need for a holistic strategy looking at both biodiversity and climate together and not seeing them separately. So the CCC highlights using functioning ecosystems for habitat and for carbon capture. That report also recognises that pursuing a single objective, irrespective of wider consequences, can lead to the failures of desired policy outcomes. And in fact, the CCC highlights the Common Agricultural Policy as an example, with the focus on yields, rather than the wider environmental benefits that we can get from our agricultural systems. So let's hope we can all move on from that positively across the UK. So to close, huge potential to apply effective NbS in arable systems. They're under very active land management. They're widespread across the UK. We're at a moment of land policy and payment reform, where we have an opportunity to integrate NbS. With careful implementation, monitoring and learning, NbS in arable systems can help tackle climate change and also create healthy, functioning landscapes for wildlife and profitable farming. Finally, I'd like to thank all the co-authors who helped on the arable landscapes chapter of this PS report, the key ones there in the slide. And personally, I'd like to thank Chris Collins for enabling me to give his talk today. Thanks very much. Okay, right, back to my chairman role now. It's question and answer time, for which we have around 15 minutes, so not too long. We've got quite a few questions coming in now. One of the disadvantages of speaking just before this, I haven't had a chance to look through them, but I did put one earlier at the head of the questions, which I thought was a good one for Mike particularly. Are there any nature-based solutions that we should prioritise over others? And are there any that we should be more cautious about at this point in time?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does depend on, what the nature-based solution for what problem we're talking about. So I think there are some things that are extremely effective. Some of the coastal managed realignment, creating wetland habitats where they've been, coastal wetland habitats like salt marsh, where they've been lost over the years, squeezed against hard flood defences. I think some of those are highly effective, good for mitigation, good for adaptation as well. Some of the realignment of rivers also. I do also think the right sort of woodland creation in the right place is a big one that does have lots of potential. And peatland restoration, I think, is a bit of a no-brainer just because of the sheer amount of greenhouse gases that are coming off of some of our degraded peatlands. Stuff in the uplands and the raised bogs, it's reasonably well established. The lowlands is a big challenge, which we have to prioritise, but there aren't so many easy answers in places like the Fens.
Thank you, Mike. And here's a specific one for Isabel, except I've lost it. How can we protect heathlands from goals for tree planting?
Well, I think, well, reminding everybody of that we are trying to address climate and biodiversity at the same time, and yeah, but heathlands are important in their own right, as I mentioned, for biodiversity and for people, and just reminding that if we lose the heathlands, first that the trees will take decades to sequester enough carbon to replace the one that we probably lose, and then we will lose many species that at the moment, at least in the UK, live nowhere else. So I think it's just a matter of information and awareness.
Thank you very much. Here's an interesting question, and this might be more for Mike. How much CO2 might be emitted because of restoration activities? Do we know that? Do we quantify that across some of these areas where habitat restoration is the key thing? For some habitats like peatlands, we know we have to go sometimes through a small emissions phase. What do we know about that?
Yeah, I mean, the devil is in the detail on a lot of these things. So we know, for example, peatland restoration, as well, you know very well yourself, Ollie, that there can be a methane spike, a pulse of methane emissions in the early stages of restoring a peatland. Depends a bit on the water level, the water table, so you can manage that down. I think It does depend. I mean, restoring a heathland by removing trees, there will be a loss of carbon. In most cases, there's no getting away from that. But these are relatively small areas we're talking about. As Isabella says, quite quite rare habitats, really. So, and of course, there is engineering work with some of the more hydrological stuff in rivers and on at the coast, particularly. There will be emissions just from the act of managed realignment. It's quite there. Although it's soft engineering, there's no getting away. There is some engineering going on there with heavy machinery. So it does depend. I mean, one of the interesting things is on woodland creation. A lot of interest in natural regeneration, allowing woodland just to grow back rather than to actively plant it, which is less soil disturbance, for example. So it's probably better than some of the planting, but may take longer. So that there's an interesting interplay there between those factors.
I think that's right. And I think the awareness of it is really important and building that into schemes. But I also think that it's really important that we actually get on with these things as quickly as possible. And as soon as we can get over that, any small hump, as it were, to get on to the benefits, that's really important for both nature and for climate change. But a very good question. Here's an interesting one. We can start with you, Isabella, this time. How can we balance the restoration of natural sites in the UK whilst also catering to the growing demand for access to outdoor spaces and recreation, which is in very limited supplies? And I think recreation is probably another part of the NbS delivery, isn't it? It is actually another NbS in some respects.
Yeah, when you are trying to provide benefits for people, then recreation is one of them. Yeah, that's a difficult balance, and we found, for example, in this last year, due to the COVID restrictions, that more people concentrated in nature reserves everywhere around the country, and some people may have been more responsible than others while using. So I think again it's a matter of maybe education and awareness of the sensibility of the sites, that not a heathland site is maybe more sensitive to disturbance than an urban park, that there are species that only live there, and it's not good that people let their dogs out everywhere. So I think again it's a matter of awareness and information, because we want both things. We want people going out and enjoying the sites, and we want the sites to be protected, and just the balance is a fine one.
It is balance. It is a fine one. But I think the point about connecting people with nature is really important as well. And I think the more we can learn, we can help people understand these areas and not just take them for granted and their particular needs. That's actually a really important one. This one might be for Mike. How strong is the evidence base for nature-based solutions in terms of quantitatively measuring the impacts or modelling and indeed the benefits? And this is the key thing, possibly. Are there recommended resources that we can use, that land managers can use in considering and implementing NbS?
Yeah, so the evidence base is different for different ones. So some things are very good. I would suggest that, at least on the timber growing side of trees, the forestry evidence base is good, because foresters have measured wood production for decades, centuries even. So things like the Woodland Carbon Code are based on pretty solid evidence. Sometimes the soil side is not as good, but even there it's still better than most. And though, so there's a lot of empirical measurement there. There's carbon flux towers that have been put over woodlands and so on. Peatlands, I think, are getting there. That's pretty good. Some of the other stuff, not so good. I'm always surprised how poor the evidence base is for many grasslands, given we've got an awful lot of grasslands here. So that's quite a key evidence gap to fill for me with more empirical evidence. And yeah, there is a combination of modelled and empirical there, but yeah, so it's a mixed picture. The coastal stuff, I feel, is not as good as we would like, given we think it's pretty important. In terms of where can you get the resources, I mean, our own Natural England website, or evidence catalogue, we've got a climate change adaptation manual, and we've got our carbon storage and sequestration by habitat report. So I'd suggest those are good places to start. On the forestry side of things, it tends to be a little bit more commercial biased, but there's a number of Forestry Commission documents, things like the Ecological Site Classification Tool and climate matching tool, and the data on on woodland creation. There's of course our own BES report. So there's a range of different things. I think there's some IUCN stuff, and the RSPB, pushing it back to you, Ollie, have produced some very good guidance.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for reminding me of that. So there is a lot of information out there. It may not be as easily collated in one place quite yet, but it sounds actually like Natural England is actually becoming a bit of a hub for that, and that's perhaps something we should think about in taking this forward and wanting to deliver more NbS, having some kind of hub. Now here's a nice one. Where would rewilding fit into nature-based solutions? What are your thoughts about it? Isabel, do you want to start with that one?
Well, I think in principle, I'm for it. And again, it's like Mike said, the right things in the right sites. I think that the most important thing is wherever we consider a land use change, to have a good ecological assessment and planning what we've got there at the moment and what we are trying to achieve, and looking at the current soil condition, carbon stocks, current biodiversity. If at the moment it's poor and we can get a much better solution with rewilding or wilding, then fine. If we got a heathland or a species-rich grassland or a peatland, it may not be such a good idea, because what we have now is valuable in its own right. And anything you can make more natural, because these habitats require, the heathlands and grasslands require management, and the others more following natural succession. They may get new species coming in, but you need to check to see and to know what you've got there now, and that you are not going to lose something irreplaceable.
Thank you. Mike, anything to add to that?
This is a slightly different point, but it is an important one. I agree with what Isabel said, but we should also take a global perspective here. And our report was quite UK focused, and most of us work in the UK primarily. But from a global perspective, actually keeping the current wild places is really important, and actually stopping deforestation and the damage to other existing intact ecosystems is actually really important. Something like 20% of greenhouse gas emissions come from land use change, particularly the degradation of natural habitats globally. So I think we also mustn't lose sight of rewilding is good, but we do need to protect the existing near natural ecosystems.
Thank you. Yes, so rewilding certainly has its place, and I think may also be a little bit misunderstood, in that certainly to get to that ultimate end of wilding or rewilding, whichever we want to call it, there is actually there is a process that needs to be gone through to understand. You don't know exactly where it's going to go, but there are certainly things that you're going to do to start that process off. So thinking about nature-based solutions in that early phase of developing the actions, as before you start to let go a little bit more, let's think about NbS as part of rewilding ultimately. That brings this month's session of AER Live pretty much to a close. We're almost on 4 o'clock. Can I thank again our speakers, Mike and Isabel, for interesting presentations, and Chris for providing me with the opportunity to tell you all about arable systems. The questions that are on arable systems that have come up, you'll notice I've completely ignored because I cannot answer those. We will see if we can get Chris to comment on those or to provide some answers for those. Next month's workshop will be our final one of the year, and we are joined by ESE lead editor, Professor Carolyn Curl and Jeffrey Seminoff, who is the leader of the Marine Turtle Ecology and Assessment Programme at NOAA. They will share some stories from experience and provide best practices for planning successful projects that involve conservation practitioners and academic researchers working together to achieve real-world impact. So that sounds really interesting. You can register if you haven't booked already by amending the AER Live event booking on your website account. And finally, we're delighted to announce that our cross-journal special feature on nature-based solutions with the Journal of Applied Ecology and People and Nature will be published in full on the 2nd of November. So that's just a couple of weeks away. The open access editorial is led by Dr. Holly Forcard-Trapp from Imperial College in London, and that will be published in the Journal of Applied Ecology's November issue, along with other articles on the theme of nature-based solutions. So watch out for announcement on the social media channels and the newsletter when the full collection becomes available. But for now, thank you all very much indeed for joining us. What's been an interesting session, and I hope we hope to see you all next month. And I hope we can all work to put nature-based solutions on a more secure footing and take advantages of this very special moment that we find ourselves in the development of policy, land and nature conservation delivery here in the UK. Thank you very much indeed. Goodbye.